Well, hello, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm your ergonaut, Andrew Clay Schaefer, and as always, we're here to explore people working together with each other and with technology. I've known today's guest for at least a decade. We met back when Velocity Conference was a thing, maybe the thing, and I think we've always got on because we both have similar thought-provoking, sardonic sensibilities. And she calls herself an internet incident librarian. So please welcome Courtney Nash, and let's have some fun. How's it going, Courtney?
Going good. By the way, the internet incident librarian did not come from me. I don't know if that originated from Casey or from James Wickett, but one of those two came up.
So are you an internet incident librarian, or are you the internet?
I am the, as far as I know, there is no other internet incident librarian on the planet. So that's kind of cool, actually.
That seems like a hard tribe to be part of, but
people don't really want to get on this bandwagon very much. No.
So it might be fun to take 2 seconds and think about how Velocity kind of blossomed into DevOps days and SRE and all this other stuff that, like, the new buzzword of the day, rotating bandwagon. I feel like we had pretty much the same conversations over and over going back to at least a decade. So that's fun.
Yeah, that might be like delightful, but also a little depressing. We have been having this some variation of the same conversation since 2011, I would say, at least, when I first started getting involved with Velocity. So
yeah, I mean, it didn't really, it's not that it didn't evolve, but to me, like, I don't get sad about this. It's just the question is not so much have we said everything? It's like, who still needs to hear it?
Yeah, well, and the industry has grown and changed massively since then. There were buzzwords now that didn't exist 12 years ago, and
I feel like they're all kind of subgenres of the same stuff that we talked about. So it's like observability became its own little thing, and chaos engineering got its own little thing, and it's like
containers. Oh, containers. Serverless, like, we could just keep now, but now we've got now we've got AI ops, the large learning, language models,
large language models. Well, I think
all the acronyms.
There's a super interesting analysis here, because there's a distinction, at least in my mind, between the words that are kind of trying to plant a flag on some technology, and then obviously there's like communities of practice that kind of emerge around that technology, and then those that are at least somewhat explicitly trying to identify as this kind of socio-technical, that they're like focused on the activities of the humans more explicitly. So that's kind of interesting to think about.
Well, those were the two things we talked about back in Velocity. Like, that hasn't changed either, right? Like, whatever the technologies were, and the communities of practice, or the cults, or the whatever that evolved around them, and then the people talking about the people, behind that, like, are the things we still talk about, and the stuff that I'm still talking about, even though I'm doing something in some ways very different. And the words we use is a big pet. Not peeve, I guess, but like is something I am focused on a lot right now, because engineers like precision, right? Like,
words are hard.
Words are hard, but we want precision. So
there's a whole long thread to pull on here about the difference between precision and accuracy as well. But we'll explore plenty of words, I'm sure, over the next few moments here. But what's the void, and what's this? Yeah. What are you cataloging as a librarian?
Yeah. So the void is the Verica Open Incident Database, and it's something that arose out of product research that I was doing for this company, Verica, who is in sort of the, well, two different spaces in some ways, chaos engineering, continuous verification, but also continuous verification of security stuff. And so there's kind of a couple different products around that. But just to back up, though, I ended up here at Velocity. See, all the V's. My life is just a set of V's. I ended up at Verica because I had known Casey from quite a while back through Velocity, and then he wrote the Chaos Engineering book, which I usually have like sitting right here, and Chaos Community Days and all of these things, and much in the same way I had known John Allspaw, and we had been sort of orbiting each other's circles like this throughout all of that time. And at some point when I was at a funky little publishing startup and during the pandemic and everyone got laid off, Casey came to me and said, hey, do you want to come, just do research on incident stuff? And like, I couldn't say no to that. And because I had fallen down this system safety nerd hole through Allspaw and other folks through
They do that.
it happens. Yeah, it happens. And so it was this opportunity to bring together a bunch of different things I had done. Some of my research background from being a neuroscience graduate student that I had sort of walked away from for a while, but then all the systems stuff, and then all the O'Reilly kind of stuff too. So I started out just doing product research, and I was researching for the initial sort of CVP chaos engineering continuous verification product, was focused initially on Kubernetes and Kafka. Because those are two technologies that are incredibly simple and no one ever has any problems with, right? So
that's that sardonic coming out.
Right, that part. But instead of like reading marketing materials or on that kind of thing, I wanted to see how these things fail in the wild, as it were. And when you can't always just go find those people, you start reading incident reports. So I had started collecting, and Dan Liu had Kubernetes AF. There were a few of these burbling around. Lex Neva, who's now at Honeycomb, had a big archive of incidents from his SRE weekly newsletter. John Allspaw gave me a whole bunch, and all of a sudden I was sitting on like 2,000 incident reports. So again, to clarify words and language, like an incident report, as we tend to know them, is like something fell over, somebody wrote about it, right? And then published it on the internet. And so it's not something, I didn't go and do this. I didn't go talk to people. I didn't interview anyone. I'm just quite literally cataloging these. And I have a database now of over 10,000, I think. And they're everything from sort of status page updates, the whole Google, status page that goes on forever, Azure, those kinds of things, to incident reports actually published, more in detail things that people might call postmortems or post-incident reports or what have you, to media outlet reports. There are companies that don't talk about their incidents. And so we're left hearing what the media has to say about it, which is a whole nother topic I love to chat about. So, and then I collect a bunch of metadata on top of that. And so things like the duration, if they say what they think the duration was, if they think what the severity was, all of this stuff, which company it was, what date it happened, all kinds of stuff, the technologies involved, and so on and so forth. And not because I think that the act itself of cataloging incidents is going to tell us anything, but I think what has happened is having a corpus of these has sparked a different set of conversations about incidents than the ones we've had in the past. And that was really my goal. My goal was, well, twofold. I wanted to have some data to dispel some myths, and maybe we'll be able to get into some of that, and maths. But I wanted to be able to have real data about things that we just talk about in the abstract, which has been a very common phenomenon. But then I wanted to start a different type and level of conversation about incidents than the ones that we've been having.
So how many incidents are there right now?
Incident reports, 10,000. Let me consult the Oracle database. It's not an Oracle, I'm kidding. The Oracle, like an actual Oracle.
Yeah, the Oracle, like the temple.
The temple, 10,306 is the current count.
We smell the vapors, and then we say
read the tea leaves.
So 10,000 seems like a lot on some level.
And yet it's
maybe on another level doesn't seem like that many.
It's probably the tip of the iceberg.
But for someone trying to make sense of 10,000, what's a way to kind of navigate or make sense of it? Or is it really just there kind of as historical artifacts?
It's a few things. I think I have known people who have run keywords through it, trying to look for various things. I am doing some research partnerships with other folks, and I've conducted my own research on it. I don't actually think that someone who's like, okay, wait, we're going to maybe, but I don't know that I don't see this as the most practical or useful application for like, oh, we're going to implement technology foo and we want to go see, you know, what's happened with people using that. Like, I don't think it's that. It's not going to help you plan out your architecture or figure out, X, Y, or Z about technology ABC. And so in that regard, it's not a predictive thing. It's not a diagnostic tool, right? At least not at this point. And there's not nearly, and we can talk about why I think the data won't really do that for people. But I think, I've conducted a bunch of research on top of it, and I write about that. There are reports that you can go get on the Void site that distill a bunch of that down for you and help people think about it that way. So, and it's a bit like, if people want to come and look at it, and if you want to come really get all the data, I will gladly, that's why it's open in that sense. Anybody can come and look at it. But the nature of these incidents and the nature of the data about them makes them remarkably slippery to,
Well, I mean, the thought I have in my head, and I poked around a little bit, but just having one different realities, like the shape and size of all these things as they happen is different. And then what gets reported about them is also going to be qualitatively and quantitatively different.
Yes.
So
by the time we have this artifact publicly, it's been distilled, reshaped, redacted, what have you, like 2 or 3 times. And it also depends on who, if they're thinking of this, who the audience is for that piece, that artifact. And some places think about that more than others, right? But you can have incident reports for engineers, you could have incident reports for PR, you could have an incident reports for CYA, you could have incident reports for whatever. There's like so many different motivations and then audiences for what those might be. And then the kind of information that's contained within them is dramatically different given those considerations.
Given what you just said, do you ever have to collate more than one because they had like multiple flavors because they had different purposes that they were putting out in?
I have not undertaken that particular approach to them. I am hoping to see if common characteristics are emergent. And the statistics language for that is looking at clustering, which I'm working on this year, versus deciding these things are like these and then putting them into those groups. But no, I haven't really done any sort of other collating. I've run a bunch of analysis on some of the metadata that I mentioned, which has been really interesting and fruitful. But
let's talk about that. So you have a background as a scientist, and you get into the middle of this game we're playing, trying to build the internet, and now you have this big pile of incidents. You mentioned that you'd written some reports, and that's kind of published, and people can go look at those. What's sort of some high points or highlights that you think people would find useful from the analysis that's already been done?
Great. I mean, so the main ones that I talk about are aggregate metrics, and one of the ways that we tend to talk about incidents, and that is honestly kind of what people consider to be the gold standard, is MTTR, right? Which is mean time to whatever your R is, and that's a whole nother thing. And people have written a million blog posts about that. But essentially, the average time to make an incident stop, and me as someone who used to deal with large data sets, like the first thing you do when you get a data set is you look at the distribution of the data. Like that is literally stats 101. You get your data and you chart them. And I looked at the data and they did not have like a normal distribution, right? Everybody knows like the bell curve, blah, blah, blah. They don't look like that. They're incredibly like left skewed, right? So the majority of incidents are resolved really quickly. We could talk about the problems with duration and that the underlying number of this for another whole 2 hours. because what is start and what is a stop and who decides and why is all subjective and so on and so forth. But if we were to take those data at face value, they're not normally distributed. So you just can't take an average of these things. And I mean, to me, statistically speaking, that was it. I looked at those, I was like, done. We don't have to talk about this anymore. But that's not how it works, right? This notion of a number, an aggregate number on a data set like these, which are wildly skewed and have long tail, that number holds power and significance in our industry in a really funny way. Like we have come to believe that it tells us about the resilience or reliability, which are not the same thing, of our systems. And to what I've discovered is climbing that hill of convincing people that's not true is going to take a lot longer than I thought it was. Not that I thought, oh, I'll just like say this out loud and everyone will just get it. That's obviously not even how the world works. Even if you're trying to change the way people think about something, you have to say it over and over again.
It's always worked for me.
Really? Somehow I don't have the formula right.
Just kidding.
But this number has become connected to a concept, right?
Well, I want to poke a little bit at the logic, and then I want to get into some of the vocabulary you just introduced. Why would you expect it or want it to be a normal distribution? Why isn't
I wouldn't actually. I don't, it's like, but I don't inherently, I wouldn't have known necessarily. Going into it, I wouldn't have expected one or the other. But if statistically we're using central tendencies, then you should only use those when you have a normal distribution. So part of me was like, well, had anybody actually looked at these? So the DORA folks who used MTTR in a lot of their research had to some degree, but what they were looking at was people's reported averages. They weren't actually and they have their own data at Google though. And Stepan Davidovich did a really cool report on how those data are not normally distributed. So not many people had looked at this yet, but there are people who were sitting on those kinds of data, including Google, to know that they're not normally distributed. And not just the self-reported means that people give, but the actual, like I said, underlying, like every single data point you used to make that mean, right? And it's those data points that are skewed. So I mean, there are natural phenomena that are normally distributed. There are natural phenomena that are not, that are log normally distributed, that are power laws, that are whatever. And until you understand enough about the system, you couldn't even necessarily say. Now that I do, I'm not surprised, because part of it is like, despite how much we talk about how stuff fails and complexity and all this, the people who build and run these systems are pretty fucking good at at taking care of them, right? And that like understanding enough about how they work that when something falls over, they're like, well, based on my mental model of this system, which is probably like not complete, I think we should try blah. And more than 50% of the time, blah gets you figured out pretty quickly, right? So it's not surprising that they're not normally distributed, because a normally distributed one would imply that.
So the criticism, like there's probably some value to thinking about this number, or you're saying there's no value, and then like there's definitely not a value to think about it in terms of a mean, because it doesn't have this central property.
Right. So John Ospo was just on this with you last time, and he used a metaphor that I love, because when I was a kid, my mom used to talk sometimes about comparing things you shouldn't compare, as comparing Volkswagens to apples, and the notion that duration is a fixed constant measure implies that the underlying system is the same, right? So like in a car, you're like, when you apply this, you get these forces, 60 miles an hour means this or whatever. But like the underlying system is not consistent in the way that we expect it, that in the way that we want it to be, to use a number like that. So so John argues, and I'm arguing with the data I have, that duration tells you literally nothing about what's happening in your systems. It doesn't tell you if you're getting better at managing them. It doesn't tell you, because they're complex, and because the nature of those systems is that the failures modes are often surprises. But being surprised doesn't mean it will take longer or shorter to fix.
If they weren't surprises, you probably wouldn't have an incident.
you'd have maybe a very predictable, like normally I don't, right? And the other thing about MTTR, just to back that up, is it comes from predictable linear systems environments, right? So MTTR comes out of manufacturing, right? So you have a line that makes widget A, and it makes widget A in this amount of time, and each subcomponent of making widget A takes this amount of time. And then when that thing breaks down, it takes you this long to fix it. Or when that thing has this kind of failure with the part, it takes you on average 2 days to fix it, or whatever.
All this statistical process control and total
Yeah.
quality.
And so because it's a process that's easily modeled, and it's a simple system, right? The inputs and the outputs are the same, and you're not going to have, right? Small input doesn't make large output, vice versa, where you don't know what's going to happen. It's not, you don't have these emergent properties. That's where MTTR came from. And it is a very valuable metric in that regard, because then you can go to your customer, your line manufacturer, and say, it's going to take us 2 days to fix this.
We need another 2 hours to rant about why metaphors for manufacturing aren't appropriate.
Are a bad idea.
for knowledge work in general.
No, they're terrible. But they're particularly terrible for complex systems that where you don't have the same input to output ratio, and you can't actually even know what the hell's going on inside. So
the questions I have in my head right now about what we've said in the last few minutes is, I think it's probably worth visiting the definitions of reliability and resilience and the distinction you'd make there. And then if you're not going to look at this metric, what are there any metrics, or what kind of things do you advocate for people to think about?
Yeah. Okay. So the 3 R's, the way we talk about these things in like sometimes just swappably, even though they're not, that I hear people use in these contexts, are robustness, reliability, and resilience, right? So robustness is the ability of a system to keep doing the exact same thing it's doing with perturbation, right? Like, so you can add robustness to something, and the more it gets perturbed, then it'll just keep doing what it's doing, right? Reliability is something that does the same process, right? It repeats the same process over and over again. And you can expect, with the same inputs and the same outputs, you'll like always get the same output, right? Same input that system is going to reliably give you the same output. Would we agree so far with these definitions?
I mean, I'm just thinking about how language is used, and I think that there's a lot of the reliability conversation where reliability is more synonymous with availability, and not. I mean, just think about how SLOs and some of that stuff gets defined.
Yep.
But I'm not necessarily arguing with your vocabulary, because one of the things I take as a best practice is like level set the conversation that you're having with the definitions you're going to use for that conversation. So.
Exactly. But what I see reading a million incident reports is people, especially not so much robustness. And I think as an industry, we're a little bit better about kind of being more precise when we use that and how it's used. But people will just interchangeably use reliability and resilience. And I think that's a dangerous conflation, right? Because they're not the same thing.
Well, right now we didn't define resilience yet.
Okay, so it's an interesting one, because I think that robustness and reliability are properties of a system, and I think that resilience is not a property. It's not a noun. It's not a thing that exists in a system. Resilience is as David Wood says, is a verb, but it's a state. It's the capacity to adapt, right? And that is not a state or a property that a system can have. But we talk about our systems as being resilient, right? And so, or reliable. And I think that if you can be very specific about what you mean by resilience, it opens up a whole different discussion, right? And a different level of thinking about what your systems are. It also makes things harder to measure, harder to quantify, hard and not impossible, but you get into sort of a there is no spoon space, right? With resilience that I think you're not going to have when you're more precise about that versus reliability.
So let's pull on this thread a bit. What it is, if it's a verb, not a noun, then how do you think about it? Or like, what if it's not a quality, what is resilience other than?
Well, what typically, you know, verbs involve action, right? And what things act in our environments, in our modern software environments?
Well, there's hopefully you have some humans that act, and then more and more there's systems that are effectively agents that,
Automated
yeah, just,
machine things, right?
yeah.
Agency things. Anything else?
uh I mean, I feel like there's a trick question here. What?
I mean, sort of. There
I
are
mean,
other
it feels
forces.
like
There are, and
the
then so let's say this: there's actors and there's forces. Let's think about it that way.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
you
okay.
identified the main things that create action, but then there are forces on that system as well, right?
Well, let's there's the things that have agency. So
Yeah.
I'd say that's the humans involved inside of the building, the
Mhm.
humans for most of what we're talking about services. There's humans outside the building. So some of those might be friends, and some of those might be foes.
Mhm.
And then you have whatever kind of logic you built into this automation that will start to look like it
Yeah,
has some
we have software agents, machine agents.
some agency. And
Yeah.
then there's like, did a meteor hit the thing, or did someone drive a truck into the data center?
See, I think there's other forces though, right? There's production pressures, there's economic forces, there's political forces, there's cultural forces.
I think that
The environment you act.
this is the vocabulary test, right? Because on some level, you could argue everything you just said is an aggregate of those agents, those human agents that are inside or outside the building.
Could be. Yes. The aggregate. Yes. Okay. But let's go back to resilience as a verb then. So a system isn't resilient, right? It is not, it's like, is it robust, right? Can it handle, is it as it stands right now, will it fall over or not fall over? So resilience is thinking about it as the capacity to adapt. And especially when you reach some of those boundaries where bad things happen, right? Where those forces are pushing you in interesting situations. So reliability is a state, robustness is a state, but resilience is a verb. And it's the capacity to adapt when you have, surprises, things that push your systems outside of their boundaries or whatnot. And so it naturally involves the people, right, and the agents, though, and how do those things work together? We don't, like, you and I have thought about the world this way for a long time, right? And we've thought about the role that people play in systems and all of that. But if I go and also again read all of these reports, what did we do after this? What did we do? And in times even when people say to increase the resilience or the reliability of our system, almost never is it about the people or about the those types of things. It's like, well, we're going to change. It's the agents often, right, or the technology, but it's not the stuff that we swim in as people too. And the metrics also reinforce that view of the world, right? The metrics are technical metrics. They are, but we claim that they're socio-technical, right? But
This is me trying to explore in my own understanding, for myself and whoever might be listening to this. And you use that word at the end, socio-technical, which, obviously passion and focus of mine. Why would you like? What? I guess I'm going to invert the argument a little bit.
okay.
Wouldn't the adaptive capacity of can you consider a socio-technical system to have adaptive capacity or resilience as a noun?
You can have I think the adaptive capacity is what you're talking about there then, right? That's more the noun. I mean, you could have an organization that has the same number of people and machines, right? And when perturbed in the same way, one will respond very differently than the other. So what
those are two different systems. They're not the same system, right? That's the definition of
what differs between them then?
Well, the way I usually frame this in kind of this lens of organizational learning is your ability to change your behavior given new information, given new stimulus. So you have, as a socio-technical system, some combination of machines and humans, agents, of all of those different shapes and sizes that we talked about before, that they can manifest new behavior.
Well, that's the poised to adapt part, which is how, sort of David Woods talks about it too. It's not just when it happens, how do you react, but that you are in a state, I guess you could say. So that is stateful, I guess, in that regard. But I think
this goes back to my own,
whether it really is a verb or not. But what I like about that way of framing is that you immediately then, we're talking about it in a very different way because of that notion, right? And I think that's what's most important. Whether resilience really is a verb or not a verb, we could continue to argue that, but that frame gives you we're talking at a completely different level and about a very different set of properties, right?
So correct my vocabulary and thinking if you don't like the way I frame this, but to me, the thing that makes something resilient is that human agency, or maybe we'll evolve with some of the new toys that are coming now, but it's that there's some changing behavior based on those pressures, those forces that you talked about. Is that fair?
Somewhat, but then we're almost shifting so hard towards the humans, right? And so we talked about it as a socio-technical system, and that you want the system to also be poised to adapt, right? And so, for example, if you have highly agentive humans, but you have like really fucking difficult to use tools, one could argue your system is not as poised to adapt, right? Because
Absolutely.
So that, and how do those humans and machines work together? Right. So I think it's easy for me too to want to always shift towards that like human agentive role in an adaptive universe.
But the tools matter, the technology matters. That's the
ability of it, the way we work together with machines and whatever representation of the world they have that we may or may not have access to. Right. Yeah. So in that sense, it is the system is poised to adapt, not just the humans.
Totally agree. It's the socio-technical, like whatever you want to call it.
And typically when things go poorly, right? I'm thinking about this in the terms of I've been rereading with a bunch of folks and thinking a lot about, are you familiar with Lassane Bainbridge's work, The Ironies of Automation?
Oh yeah. So I basically give that out every time
it's kind of required reading. That and like how complex systems fail, right? Like here's your starter kit. But what I think about that in particular, the piece that she identifies is so important is if you don't have a view of joint cognitive system, right? To use the very fancy term for all of that. If you hand over all of the sort of automated parts to the machines and they go do this stuff, and then when shit does go south and you have to jump in, you lack context. You lack experience with the system. You have to make difficult decisions under pressure. And it's at that moment in particular that those sort of, tools, bad usability interfaces of humans and machines matter the most. And we've often co-opted so much of that away and put it in a place where we as the operators don't have access to it. We don't have experience with the system. So it's a very interesting.
By design, we abstracted it away farther and farther and farther. And then when we really need to know how it works, or like imagine that we don't have access.
And we're making that worse now, right? So like if AI is writing your code, if ChatGPT is writing it, you can't go ask ChatGPT, hey, bud, what were you thinking when you did X? Which you can still go do with a human, right? Or with some ways that humans and systems interact.
I might actually just a little bit here because it's pretty good at explaining code if you ask some of these tools to do.
Explaining existing code, but can it tell you what it was thinking when it came up with it?
I would wager that most humans aren't particularly good at that either. If
they may not be, but they're going to give you maybe a little more thread to pull at, I would argue. But the premise of
I mean, this hypothesis is going to be tested on a regular basis going forward. So
yeah. But anyways, I think the more we think of these as joint cognitive systems, the better off we're going to be at developing that kind of adaptive capacity. How do these things work together? What happens? How do we do this when it goes south? Like, what information do we have available to us in the system? So that's where I feel like it's easy for us to swing either direction, and the middle ground or not middle ground, but the common ground, is an interesting place to be. And we don't. I think especially for people in sort of infrastructure and operations, like, those tools suck. No, sorry, like, no offense, y'all, but like, we don't have UX designers coming in and trying to figure out, watching how you run Terraform to like, we just don't. We just are like, yeah, and like a lot of times also it's like something that one person built for themselves because they needed it right then, and then that gets weirdly baked into like reality. Oh, and then also they leave the company, and and so
I think you bring up a good point, because there's a lot of what I'll call over rotation onto developer experience, and operator experience is probably undervalued. But when you start thinking about what happens when things go sideways, so with the vocabulary, let's talk a little bit about the analysis, and is there some big takeaways or things you would point to from?
Okay, so people always ask me, you've taken away my favorite toy, you've taken MTTR, like, what are you going to give me in return?
What's my new toy? Give me a new
toy. Like, well, and I mean, to be fair, most people who are being asked to generate this are here at the sharp end, and it's someone back here, right, who's asking for this, who believes that it's an indicator of, and metrics.
They might have read a book that told them they should ask for it.
They might have, but also, I mean, metrics have their place. I don't want to completely be like, we should never measure shit, right? Like, I mean, and at the blunt end of a system, you only have so many things you can hold on to and so much time and attention to try to get a feel for what the hell's happening, right? So I do believe that in some cases, aggregate metrics can be incredibly useful, but in this particular situation, I argue they're not. So if not MTTR, then what is the most common question I get asked? And I say, find ways to go measure the things we literally were just sort of talking about, right? Like, what are indicators of the difficulty of navigating that socio-technical system when it doesn't go as you want it to, right? And then it turns out there's like research behind some of this stuff, and there's actually people collecting some of these things. So one of my favorite ones is Laura McGuire, who did her PhD dissertation work on cost of coordination, right? Which is looking at what happens during an incident, right? Who gets involved? How are they involved? What roles do they have? How many people are? What kinds of communication channels are they using? What things increase that cost of coordination and the cognitive load on the people working in those systems? And you can actually like look at this stuff. And even some of the cooler new tools out there will give you some of this stuff. Like if you're using like Jelly, who she's working for, or Incident, or some of these things, you can actually see like what Slack channels people are in, how many people from which teams. And that is one really cool indicator of sort of like actually the complexity to some deal of an incident you're dealing with. There's lots of things it doesn't tell you, but it tells you a lot more than MTTR does about the, like what it takes to handle your system when it goes sideways. And then there's even other things that folks are looking at about like whether people are learning from these incidents, right? And how is that learning getting distributed throughout the organization? Because what people remember and what like how their mental models adapt is a big part of that adaptive capacity that you're talking about, right? You can't just go measure learning. Like,
yeah, how would one do that?
You shouldn't, but you can measure whether it's spreading, right? Like you can look at, how many people are reading your incident reports? Are they getting used in code commits? Are they getting used in onboarding? Are they getting used in training materials? And David Lee is actually doing this at IBM in like a 20-something thousand person organization, the office of the CIO at IBM. And he's actually showing like more people are coming to these, incident review meetings. Executives are seeing the value in them. They're wanting more of this happening. They're seeing that it's helping their teams, sort of grapple with these things. So socio-technical systems should have socio-technical metrics. Ta-da! And what's cool is there are now tools that are helping people collect those kinds of things. Like, who was involved? How heavy was that, sort of conversational cognitive load for them? Did you have to also pull in PR, marketing, executives, customer service? Like this stuff's there and they're pulling it in now. And so it's cool in that regard too, that it's like, that I think is starting to happen. So those are the kinds of metrics I tell people to go collect. I also have mixed feelings about like SLOs and SLIs. I don't think they're a silver bullet, and I think that they can have a lot of the similar problems. But what I like about those a little bit better, depending on how a team and an organization does them and whether they're even capable of it, is that they're at least thinking about the impact of systems on customers, whatever you want to put that, or users, right? Versus just in the abstract, right? Like, what the hell does 5 nines get you? 6 nines? How many nines? If it's over like someone's home internet pipe, they don't, like in the abstract, 5 nines doesn't matter. In the concrete experience of the person, are they getting what they want or expect? I like that about SLOs and SLIs to a degree. I think they can also lead people down dangerous paths, but.
No one's ever gone down a dangerous path in this whole thing. I think that anytime, and it kind of goes back to the root of the conversation, that something gets simplified to something that people think they could blindly implement without too much thought, then you end up with these super gamified. When you were describing some of the narrative a minute ago, and saying, oh, like the executives are showing up or these people are reading it, it almost begs the question, what other kind of things are going on that, that there's also the Hawthorne effect, right? Like when you start to shine light on certain things, and then that metric will change because people know you're looking at it.
Well, or isn't that Goddard's law or whatever? The second you make it a target, like whatever, people will incentivize, or not, an incentive, a target, whatever. They will do really stupid things to hit that. I don't know. So, but what I think is interesting is how it's possible for very subtle shifts in language to open up the way you think about something. I don't find that surprising as somebody as like a psychology background type of person, but there's my other favorite cool piece of research out there is Krista Vessel did her dissertation work on this, but it's how I think we commonly think as humans that our brains shape our language, right? Like words come from our brain, like we generate language and it comes out of our mouths. But she has some really cool research that shows that the way we talk about things influences our mental models of the world too. And it's like really good research. So it's not like Malcolm Gladwell TEDx talk stuff. This is like legit, really good. So I like to think about it in that term. And like, I feel like the conversation we had about robustness versus reliability versus resilience is a really good example of that. And that even just going through that, trying to get a group of people together to maybe you're not exactly aligned or right. I might be wrong about my definition by some, other standard, but like the way we started talking about things when we started talking about like, is resilience a verb, opened up a whole different level of thinking about it. So that's where I think the role of language. The same thing is like.
So I'm not very familiar with that research you just mentioned, but once one of my kind of like fascinations is language acquisition, and then language acquisition as a model for learning technology, also interesting. But as soon as you start to study foreign languages, I think some of what you just mentioned becomes apparent pretty quickly, just because the model is different. It changes the model as you try to map the meaning and semantics back and forth between the two different things.
Well, so like the example in that research is just between English and Spanish.
Okay.
And it's really, really cool because what we were just talking about was like agentiveness, right? Like humans and software have agency in our, software world. And some languages and the way we perceive them are more agentive than others. So English language is very agentive. Like everything is Mary threw the ball, John dropped the brush, you hit their car. And we view the world through that lens. And it's in some ways shapes a lot of how our society kind of functions. Although that's not a perfect generalization across like English versus other even, sort of Romance languages. But in Spanish, it's much less agentive, right? Like if I knock a plate off the table, it would be like, oh, I knocked the plate off the table. But like Spanish wise, it's like the plate knocked off the table. Like the plate like is off the table. And so there's these fundamental structural differences that then have like cognitive impacts as well.
So my brain's kind of tingling thinking about some of the stuff we talked about, because one of the things I got really fascinated with in my language learning journey is how different languages encode the object and the subject, and then the relation between those and the way
the what this is. Yeah. So here's the cool part of the research. Then gave people, native English speakers, agentive and non-agentive scenarios, and then asked them after the fact about those. And if you get agentive language, you're more likely to sort of blame the person in the accident. And if you get non-agentive language, you're less likely to associate or assign blame in an incident or an accident. And I was just like, because the non-agentive language is like passive voice.
And we've spent 45 minutes talking about incidents and accidents, and who are we going to blame, Courtney?
Yeah. So, but the thing is like, I had this moment of like, oh my God, maybe we should really write these incident reports more as like the DNS server, like blah, blah, blah. I'm making shit up here, right? Because it's so complex, you can't blame anything. But also, like, I hate passive voice, like as an editor, and I will yell at people like, don't do it, don't. But I'm starting to be like, God, should we do more of that? Because, and like, she even went so far as to look at like legal cases. And like legal cases where there's more or less agentive language. If there's more agentive language, they're more likely to hand out harsher fees and longer sentences and like all this stuff. It's just like, oh, Jesus. We should do a whole nother session on that, because it's wild, but it's real. And so then it really makes me think about how we write about these things and how people talk about it. And maybe we should be less agentive. I don't know.
So this may or may not be an association that comes together in your head or anyone listening's head. But one of the things I'm fascinated with in this kind of SLO conversation that we just sort of touched on a minute ago is everyone gets, I mean, partly because it's a prerequisite to get to the next part of the conversation. Everyone kind of gets focused on, oh, there's like this number, and then that's your air budget. What I think is interesting is how the SLO acts as a prompt for actions, and what, because I one of the things I like about SLOs is it gives you this almost dispassionate way to talk about how these things are going to inevitably fail, and then when they do fail, not necessarily what should happen in the incident, because I don't think it necessarily adds to that, but then what should we prioritize going forward?
Yeah. What informs the decisions you make?
Yeah, for whatever we think we're going after here, but like to improve the system, what should we prioritize? And I think that's really interesting to work through for a bunch of reasons.
Well, I like it because it's like a social contract, right? It's like you and I agree that in these situations, these things are acceptable and these things are not acceptable. And that's like, in this theory, written down, and like kind of used to be more written down than it is now for humans. But yeah, it is more objective. I mean, it's not objective. SLOs are, I think, largely still very subjective. But it's what was the word you used? It's like not political, but that's not the right word. But it's I don't know.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but
It's like having house rules. You can point to the house rules, like, you know, like, here, we all agree these are the rules. Like, so it's not like arguing over the fundamentals of it anymore. You're like, okay, yeah, we already all had this discussion and agreed on this. So I don't know.
Watching a lot of people change their titles from DevOps to SRE or what have you, it's very interesting to watch organizations, because I think there's two big speed bumps, and then they kind of connect back to incidents and some of the other stuff we saw up here. The first is you don't even have SLIs, so how can you talk about SLOs? Because you didn't really, you can't characterize your systems because you don't have good measurements. And then once you get to the point where you have something that everyone sort of believes or has a little bit of faith in for those metrics, then trying to explain to the typical enterprise BU product manager that when you exceed your air budget, that developers are going to work on reliability makes people's heads explode.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think, yeah, I would love to talk about error budgets a bunch more sometime, but we probably don't have enough time for that.
So we spent the better part of an hour, and I always have a good time, and definitely got some thoughts to go take away, and maybe we could do this again sometime in the future. We already mentioned a few topics that'd be fun to unpack.
Yeah.
What is from your kind of librarian perspective, it's not just about a new toy, but it's also about, kind of like the order and the priority. And a lot of people, it's interesting because there's a new buzzword every day, and then there's kind of like a new silo and a new funding, and the analysts need a new buzzword because they want a new thing to talk about too, and then it kind of goes in these cycles. But then I go around the world, and I'm in a room full of people, and they don't really have some of the basic vocabulary for the DevOps conversations or the SRE. Like literally talking to people who have these titles, and then it's like, okay, well, what are your SLOs? Okay, you told me your SREs. Okay, but you don't have SLOs. Oh, what do you do?
Those cargo, like, we can't use that term anymore. What's like the better term than cargo culting nowadays? Like,
I've been that's a totally different language construct. Yeah. I don't know if there's a better one. I haven't found a better one, but I have stopped using that one because of all the reasons.
Colonialism, Andrew, colonialism. But we need a better one. Co-opting just doesn't quite hit the nail on the head.
Because what you need to capture is the application of rituals, kind of
of things that appear to be rituals, but that have been derived from a historical series of
ritualizing something.
Yes.
Without a true understanding of what was happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting metaphors, but we haven't got a word. It feels like that's a word we need somehow to.
We need to make a new word, Andrew.
But the point I was trying to get to and make here is there's still rooms full of people. They're trying to do this work that just have been kind of through whatever marketing or like exposure to this, that their CTO read, change titles, but have really very little kind of exposure to the core concepts that would help them improve and ultimately be successful or resilient, whatever words we want to use there. And that's one, like I don't think it's necessarily wrong or bad. It's just what it is. Like, we just have to recognize that there's so much more work to do, and trying to give people like the right inputs for them to make progress without too much kind of admonishment. Like, what are you talking about? Why don't you know this? Why? Like, because then you're people there too.
Yeah. I think I'm obviously biased, but I really like the incident space because I feel like it's the most excellent Trojan horse. We can still use that one, right? Can we still use Trojan horse? It's acceptable.
I think all the Greeks that care are gone. So
true story. It is a very Western metaphor, but we could maybe come up with a better one. But it is a very excellent Trojan horse for getting to some of these kinds of conversations, right? Like, because when you start with incidents, it's something everybody understands, largely everybody feels the pain of in some way, shape, or form at the organization that they're in. And then you can back your way into some of these kinds of conversations. And I think if you're doing that in a empathetic and not, sort of how could you not know kind of way, for me, I've always found it's easier to get into those discussions and trying to start here and go, to helping people figure some of those things out. But I don't have it. Where's Velocity, Andrew? There is no place to send people to get this stuff. That's also what's really hard.
We need to make a new Velocity.
Do we?
Well, one of the things I'm interested in, and I'll if you humor me for a second, I feel like the dev and ops conversations, while maybe not everyone's had them and got to where they get the full benefit of that work so far, that there's actually this kind of more interesting socio-technical system to consider the way that product management and leadership and like some of these other things fit into the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of my little rants right now is that platforms are not products because everyone's trying to say they are, which is like, okay, show me your P&L. But anyway,
Have you shown their P&L yet? That would be great.
No. Well, there's a bunch of things to like. If you needed to say it's a product for you to recognize that you should improve it to be fit for your purpose, then by all means go do that if that helps you. But that I don't think that's the right framing for what most people need to do. But maybe there's a way to have the humor Andrew conference where we get that kind of like collective socio-technical system representative to show up and make interesting conversations happen.
That would be really interesting. Socio-tech con. Oh, we'll work on this. We have to make now a new word and a new conference. So
we've done this before. We could do this.
Totally, it's fine. We'll have it figured out by tomorrow.
Well, I think it might take a week. It's fine.
Okay.
So I think I would since to talk to you all day, but I should probably go do some of the work I told people.
I have children to get from a school down the street too. There's life.
I'm 1 hour away from that dad taxi motion that I'm going to go do myself. So with that, is there any kind of parting wisdom other than, go read the internet and digest all the language? There's 10,000. Okay.
Well, here's one thing we didn't get to that I think about this, chew on this. The back to incident land, like my favorite place. If you want to get better at understanding them, learning from them, yada, 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 you can go read some stuff I've done. You can do all of that. But the thing that I think people who are getting really good at this have realized is the skill set for building, maintaining, operating, troubleshooting these kinds of complex systems is not the same skill set involved in understanding what happened when they went wrong and investigating that and documenting that and sharing that and spreading that out into the world. If you were to ask me like what trend I'm looking forward to in 2023, Andrew, it would be people hiring incident analysts or training people to become incident analysts because it's kind of like, well, you were a really good developer, now you're a manager, like with like no help, right?
What could possibly go wrong?
Nothing. And so now we're chucking people into investigating or writing up incidents, and they have none of those skill set. Now, is that to say that like you can't acquire it? Absolutely not. These are like things that people also go to school for or don't, journalistic schools, and they are skills that most humans can develop if they want to, should they? And I'm arguing that you should, if you care about that piece of the puzzle, and that piece of the puzzle reveals all of these truths about your socio-technical systems. which is why I think they're the wedge in that tells you about what's happening back here, right?
So aspirationally, I love this idea. What I see more and more in the enterprise is operations is often this unfunded mandate.
Yeah.
And then it's like the answer, oh, you should just like hire more people to like do this other thing that you don't understand.
Make it more robust, Andrew. Make it more robust.
I think we want to make it more robust, but it kind of goes back to this humor me conf, because I don't think a lot of leadership understands some of this stuff that is happening in the engine room that would benefit from these kind of investments, and they just kind of like push more and more of that burden into who's ever on the other side of it. And it would be better for everyone to kind of get to that next level and make that investment, and eventually be probably less expensive, but it just seems like a cost in organizations that have framed all that as a cost center in the first place. So that makes sense.
Well, and these stories are out there, right? Train companies where everything just, all the engineering knowledge evaporated, and is, Southwest Airlines, right? Where no one like knew what was happening anymore, like where they used to essentially walk the floor every day. And that those groups of people were the ones responsible for the reliability, resilience, whatever you call it, of the product. And therefore they were the most valuable, because without it, you didn't have a fucking product.
But that's also an example of an unfunded mandate, because they just basically let it melt down, and then it happened again.
Yeah. But yeah, no, humor me sounds great. I love it. But yeah, not knowing what's going on in the engine room is a persistent problem.
So with that, I'll let you go take care of your other responsibilities and obligations. And I just like to thank you for your time and letting you come share this with the rest of the world.
Well, thank you for letting me rant with you. I always enjoy it. Let's do it again.
We'll do it again.